Hello guys, welcome back. So today in this video we are going to focus on some of the important Springboot interview questions which are expected to be asked from an fresher. So there will be 10 to 12 basic questions in this video, and in the next video we are going to cover advanced level interview questions for experienced Java developers which are working on Springboot as a framework. So let's discuss the first question. What are the advantages of using Springboot? So Springboot is easy to understand, and it is used to develop the Spring based applications. Next is Springboot is an existing framework with an addition of an embedded HTTP server and annotation configuration, which makes it easy to understand and make the process development faster as compared to the previous process in which we need to write the code in XML file and all the dependencies we need to add there. But here we can just add the annotation on our method, or we can say the class wherever required on a particular module, and all the imports can be done through that annotation itself. Next is it increases the productivity and reduce the development time, as by providing the annotations and the faster way to develop the application, it reduces the development time and it increases the productivity. It requires a minimum configuration form.xml file, and we don't need to write any XML configuration. That is the most important thing we need to note down. While using Spring Boot, we are not required to write any XML configuration. Only a few annotations are required to do the configuration. We have already discussed these annotations in the previous video. You can check out the playlist related to Spring Boot questions series. Now next, question number 2 is, what are the Spring Boot key components? Below are the 4 key components of a Spring Boot. First one is Spring Boot auto configuration. Next, Spring Boot CLI. Next is Spring Boot starter POMs, that is project object models. And next is Spring Boot actuators. So these are the 4 components, key components of Spring Boot. Question number 3, why Spring Boot over Spring? So the question here saying that why we prefer using Spring Boot over Spring. Why not we are using only Spring? Why we are using Spring Boot? Because Spring Boot provides a starter POM, and version management can be done using Spring Boot. Auto configuration can be done using Spring Boot. Component scanning is done through Spring Boot, and embedded server can be used using Spring Boot, and in-memory DB is provided by Spring Boot, and actuators are also provided by Spring Boot. So these features are not provided by Spring, hence we are using Spring Boot in the development of our application. Now Spring Boot simplifies the Spring feature for the user. Let's see it with the help of this diagram. So here it says that this is a particular user and this is a Spring Boot, and it is using all the Spring based properties, or we can say the features of Spring are used by Spring Boot, which in turn used by the developer. Okay, now next is the next question in this video is, what is the starter dependency of the Spring Boot module? So starter dependency के बारे में हमें यहाँ पर बताना है. So Spring Boot provides a number of starter dependency. Here are the most commonly used. The first one is data JPA starter, test starter, security starter, web starter, mail starter, and theme leaf starter. So these are all the starter dependency we can use in a Spring Boot module. Next thing is, how does Spring Boot work? So we need to understand the working of Spring Boot. Spring Boot automatically configures our application based on the dependencies that we add to the project by using annotation. So the main role is played by annotation. Okay, so we need to understand why annotations are being used and how to use them, and which all annotations are the most important one. I have already discussed in the previous video. I am telling you again and again. Just go through that video before moving on towards this video. Then entry point of this Spring Boot application is the class that contains the @Spring Boot annotation and the main method. Okay. Now Spring Boot automatically scans all the components included in the project by using @component scan annotation. Next, moving on towards this next question. What does Spring Boot application annotation internally do? So we need to understand the working of the Spring Boot annotation internally. Now Spring Boot application annotation is equivalent to the @configuration, @enable auto configuration and @component scan annotations with their default attributes. Spring Boot enables the developer to use a single annotation instead of multiple annotations. So this annotation basically allowing the user or the developer to use it singly in terms of instead of using 3 annotations at the same class. So, but as we know, Spring provides loosely coupled features that we can use for each annotation as per our project's needs. So, as and when required, these configurations are also used as per the project requirement. Now, the next question is, what is the purpose of using component scan in the class files? The Spring Boot application scans all the beans and the package declarations when the application initializes. So we are using this component scan for scanning all the beans and package declaration when the application initializes initially, and we need to add the component scan annotation for our class file to scan the components added to the project. So this thing we need to understand. Next is related to Spring Boot. How does a Spring Boot application get started? So let's go through this question. How does a Spring Boot application get started? So just like any other Java program, a Spring Boot application must have a main method. We need to have a main method in the Spring Boot application because we are using the Java program in this Spring Boot application itself. So the main requirement of Java program is a main method. So we need to create a main method in the Spring Boot application as well. This method serves as the entry point. So basically the execution of this program starts from this method itself, which invokes the Spring application run method to bootstrap the application. Basically, to start the application, this run method is invoked by this main method of we can say the Java program of this Spring Boot application. So similarly, the example is also provided here that we can declare this class my application and public static void main string arguments. This is the main method, and here we have written spring application.run my application.class. Okay, so it's very simple. Once you start with this, you will find it easy. Now, what are the starter dependencies? Spring Boot starter is a Maven template. So basically, it is a Maven template that contains a collection of all the relevant transitive dependencies that are needed to start a particular functionality. Like we need to import Spring Boot starter web dependency for creating a web application. Okay, so we need to add this dependency in this pom.xml file, where after that we can use the annotations related to this we can say this dependency. Okay, so all the annotations provide get their authority from this pom.xml file, which is basically a configuration file in which all the details related to our imports are presented in this dependency level, and all the project level configuration are set in this file itself. Next question is, what is Spring Initializer? Spring Initializer is a web application that helps you to create an initial Spring Boot project structure and provides some Maven or a Gradle file to build your code. It solves the problem of setting up a framework when you are starting a project from scratch. So basically, it is an initializer, and we are using it to create an initial Spring Boot project structure so that we can start with the code instead of wasting our time in setting up the project structure. Okay, we can update the structure later on, but Spring Initializer provides us with the uh, ability to get the initial Spring Boot project structure so that we can add our code as per our requirement. Now the next question is question number 11. What is a Spring Boot CLI and what are its benefits? So let's discuss what are the benefits of Spring Boot CLI. So first of all, Spring Boot CLI is a command line interface, as the CLI stands for command line interface, that allows us to create a Spring based Java application using Groovy. So we can use Groovy for developing the Spring based Java application, and the CLI that is used is Spring Boot CLI. Now for example, we need to create getter and setter method or access modifier return statement. Now if we use this JDBC template, it automatically loads for us, right? So that is the use of Spring Boot CLI. Now next is question number 12. That is the last question in this series of basic level questions. After this, in the next video, we are going to discuss the advanced level questions. So let's complete this video with proper understanding. Now what are the most common Spring Boot CLI commands? Let's see. These are run, test, grep, jar, var, install, uninstall, init, and in init we are using a double dash that needs to be noted down here. And next is shell, and the last one is help. So these are not only the CLI commands, but these are the most commonly used CLI commands. So to check this, what we can do is just we can check the description by running the spring help from the terminal. Like this we can do. We need to write this command, and it will say spring help version command arguments. So we can do using this help function of spring in the terminal. Okay, so that's all in this video. So in the next video, let me show you what we are going to discuss in the next video. You can see here we have advanced Spring Boot questions. So here we will start from question number 13 in the next video, and we will try to complete it in the next video itself. So all the best. That's all. Thank you.